All right, cool. Well, welcome to the second installment of our Jazz Anthropology virtual panel. This was part of our Jazz in the Hills presentation, which was the kind of Orlando version of International Jazz Day, which was held last Thursday, not last week Thursday, but Thursday, April 30th. It's a big UNESCO-sponsored event, International Jazz Day. Our local version of it was put on by the Greater Orlando Cares Mentoring Movement. And so we were going to give some talks there, decided that it would be better to put it in a digital format to expand it, expand our audience a little bit. So we're going to have three installments. Each of our distinguished panelists is going to be presenting on some topic of jazz, related to jazz, in relationship to African American culture and history, also to kind of broader African diasporic musical and cultural traditions. So we just heard from Dr. Sunny Whitmer, the adjunct professor of musicology at Rollins College. Next up, we have Julian Chambliss, who's associate professor and department chair of history, as well as the coordinator of the Africa and African American Studies program at Rollins College. So I will pass it over to him.
Hi. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Sunny. I'm going to talk to you about Harlem and its intersection with our sort of American jazz experience. I'm going to say right away, it is not going to be as musical or as interesting as Sunny's or Eric's, but hopefully I make up with that by having a visual that I think will be interesting. And so I'm going to pop that over, and hopefully you can see that. Hopefully you can see my slide. It looks slightly backwards to me, but hopefully you're seeing the slide that says Harlem. Are you guys seeing that slide?
Yes.
Okay. This is actually a map of the nightclubs of Harlem that was created in the 1930s. Of course, when we talk about Harlem and the American experience, and I have a close-up of that to give you some sense, let me say right away, this is not to scale. Not to scale. Clearly, Harlem is a bigger space. But when we talk about Harlem as a cultural landscape for African Americans, I'm going to close that now. What you're talking about, of course, is the transformation associated with the decline at some level of the housing and urban experience in Harlem that happened early in the 1880s. Harlem was actually a white neighborhood that slipped into decline, but they had started rebuilding it in anticipation of a subway line opening up, connecting Harlem to the mid part of Manhattan. They overbuilt, however, and by the time you got to the 1920s, they had excess housing stock. And that housing stock was ripe for African Americans who were migrating out of the South, in part because of the Great Migration that was created by World War I. This is one of the sort of seminal movements in terms of African American culture, and this fundamentally transformed the American urban experience. Prior to this, black populations in urban centers in the North were relatively small. One of the things that's really interesting, of course, you look at a place like Chicago or a place like New York in the 1908s or 1900s, as it were, between 1900 and 1910, for instance, the dialogue around race is actually quite complicated. You look at a place like Chicago, African Americans are one of many minority groups that are concerned for the white residents. This is a period of reform and progressive reform, and progressivism means many different things, but one of the things that it did was concerned with what to do with the other, and that other was actually defined quite broadly. African Americans were one of the others, but also white ethnics of various stripes were also part of that narrative. Nonetheless, by the time you get to 19-teens and the breaking out of World War I, America's eventual involvement, this is very important for African Americans because it opened the door for African Americans to migrate out of the South in larger numbers than they ever had before, and to have, once they arrive in the North, a place to work, because that war took large numbers of large numbers of white people away and opened the door for African Americans being employed in factories across the Northeast and Midwest, and even in the West as well. You see some migration to the West. So Harlem is actually sort of built on this massive influx of African Americans and the sort of cultural space that they create. At the time, I think it's important to recognize that white people are not in favor of African Americans arriving in such large numbers. They banded together in the early part of the 19 teens to try to prevent African Americans from buying property, but many white residents, liking money, actually decided not to stay with the sort of home improvement associations, which were actually a quite common way for white people to stop African Americans moving into the neighborhood, create home improvement associations with covenants that prevented African Americans, that had caveats that African Americans could not buy. But that did not work in Harlem. In some level, white people just gave in and like sold, and actually sold often to African Americans and at higher rates than they would to white people. So if you look at the actual rents that people pay in Harlem in the late 19 teens and early 1920s, they're actually quite high versus the rest of the city. Some research shows that the average person pays rent of something like $6.50 if they're white, but they're paying like $9.50 or $10 if they're black. Nonetheless, being concentrated in such a small space allowed for African Americans to really support cultural institutions, business institutions, and self-help organizations, all of which headquartered in Harlem. Many of them older and have been established in the late 19th century, but really get a new focus and push in Harlem. And Harlem becomes a space, especially in the 1920s, of both entertainment and cultural narrative attached to African Americans. The cultural narratives are quite complicated, in part because they run the gamut of the black experience at the time. Many of the people who are most notable associated with the Harlem Renaissance and the Harlem cultural landscape, people like Alan Locke, are college educated, and they advocate for African Americans producing arts and culture that are as important or as engaging as white culture. Other figures at that same period tended to question whether or not just simply creating art would be enough to overcome some of the racism that was associated with the black experience in America at the time. But this dichotomy, this sort of like idea of a talented 10% that sort of exemplified that African Americans could do versus a more grassroots working class perspective, also plays itself out in Harlem in startling ways. But jazz is actually one of the things that really defines Harlem both internally and externally. That map that I showed you show all those jazz clubs, and by the time we get to 1920, because of the Volstead Act, which of course is prohibition, Harlem is seen as a space of both illicit entertainment as well as this sort of like cultural renewal. So it's illicit if you're white people who are sneaking up to Harlem to partake in the jazz clubs and the speakeasies, the most famous of which being, of course, the Cotton Club, which featured many a famous jazz performer from Duke Ellington to Cab Calloway, all of which were sort of presented in this club owned by a white gangster, and this really becomes like a kind of emblem of jazz and of the Harlem nightlife. And the Harlem nightlife is, of course, an important part of the literary and cultural narratives that are coming out of Harlem. Because if you look at an author like Charles Mackay, he's talking about that nightlife and the sort of nooks and crannies and dark corners, as well as Langston Hughes, while someone like Alan Locke wants to feature the sort of like innovation and cultural diversity that you can see in terms of like the black perspective being honed in new cultural venues that are supported by this sort of critical mass in Harlem. So you see these two sort of competing ideas playing themselves out in ways that are really impressive. Publications like The Crisis magazine, which is published by NAACP, or Opportunity, which is published by the Urban League, feature short stories and poems and bits of plays that are coming from new black writers, and all of these cultural artifacts are really attacking the idea of African Americans not being able to, and you can fill in the blank, not being able to write, not being able to sing, not being able to produce at a level and an ability equal to whites. And Locke himself is a very strong advocate of this, right? Locke has a PhD in philosophy and is one of those really an exemplar of this talented 10th% idea. And that idea is an important one that sort of defines the early 20th century for African Americans. I mentioned this talented 10th idea, and I want to make sure that I make it clear. When we talk about that talented 10th, we're really talking about a dichotomy between two sort of African American leaders of this period. One is Booker T. Washington, who really emerges as the most important African American leader in the United States in beginning in the 1890s and really sort of bleeding into the early 20th century. The other figure is W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, of course, would be a founding member and an important voice in the Niagara movement, and then a founding member and an important voice in the NAACP, and the editor of its magazine, The Crisis. The difference between these two views is often simplified into W.B. Du Bois believed in sort of like this talented tip idea that like elites, African Americans should press themselves for sort of articulating a cultural, political, and economic self that was exactly like white people or equal to white people, whereas Booker T. Washington was associated with a kind of vocational education and conservative wait your turn sort of approach. Those two views were a little ardent in their sort of presentation. I think we can see examples of both in both, but in the reality is that tension between the sort of urbane, sophisticated, educated, upper class African Americans, many of which are going to be very important to the cultural institutions found in Harlem, and the sort of working class, rural experience of African Americans, many of which are going to be drawn to Harlem, but not necessarily able to participate in all these sort of sophisticated cultural narratives, becomes one of the sort of underpinnings of the Harlem space and place. Organizations like the UNIA, which is led by a guy named Marcus Garvey, articulate a black self-help and empowerment movement that you would think would correspond very strongly with W.B. Du Bois. But the way that Garvey did it, the notions that he had about the sort of African Americans and as sort of like kings, he would give out like titles and sort of coined himself and thought of himself as sort of like the leader of the black people. His UNIA group wore uniforms and had marches in the streets. Du Bois thought of Garvey as a buffoon, and Garvey thought of Du Bois as an idiot. That's a simplification, but you can see that they were on opposite sides of that discussion. At the same time, the cultural and artistic endeavors that are coming out of Harlem really do become a space where a lot of white people do recognize that African Americans can in fact create these things that are on par with white people. And jazz is one of those things that really becomes like a pertinent narrative of African Americans that permeates out into the wider world. And in fact, jazz becomes one of the things that other people of the world, when they think about African Americans, really use to define it. Not surprisingly, jazz records that are created and recorded in spaces and places across Harlem become valuable parts of a kind of Atlantic and hemispheric dialogue about music, about culture, absorbed by Europeans, people in the UK, people in France, who are very, very moved by these cultural products. At the same time, the illicit nature of jazz, that connection to the nightclubs, and some of that narrative that is formulated by people like McKay that talks about some of the darker corners of the urban environment that is Harlem. And there is darker corners, right? Remember, it is prohibition. If you remove black people from this equation and talk about Al Capone and prohibition, that narrative still applies. It's not necessarily that black people are criminal, it's prohibition creating criminality and criminal empires. And so that reality and the very real struggles associated with racism that had not gone away, and there were real scars for many African Americans that prompted them to try to leave the South and leave rural locations and go to urban locations because there's protection there, there's institutions there, there's support there. All those things become very important. A figure like Zora Neale Hurston became, I think, at some level, highly critical of this, of this elite narrative that was associated with the Harlem Renaissance. Hurston, of course, came from Eatonville, which is right outside Orlando, the first incorporated African American community in the United States. And Hurston was critical of some of these elite efforts to codify and position African Americans as directly equal to white people, not because she did not believe it, but because she thought of it as devaluing black culture. And at some level, the critique here is important because Hurston, and same way Langston Hughes, talked about an authentic black culture that needed to be articulated and shared and celebrated and enforced. And the leadership of the Harlem Renaissance at some level was critical of that sense of like black culture is different. They wanted to be included in the canon. And so what you see is not that they are thinking that not both sides believe that black culture is important, but its positioning relative to the mainstream culture becomes a crucial part of this dialogue. And so when you look at a place like Harlem, what you see on the surface and what you hear in broader culture is this jazz that is really, transforming the American experience, and it is in fact the jazz age, and rightly so. Jazz is an important part of the narrative of the period, but at the same time, from the African American perspective, there's this question and real questions of appropriations associated with this period, and so that becomes a really complicated narrative that contours and describes how jazz should be understood in American perspective. And so I think this question of appropriation is an important one, both in terms of like how it's affecting the people who are creating the art, and in terms of like how it's affecting the broader culture that is absorbing the art. And I think that's something that Aaron will be able to talk a little bit about in our next session. Thanks.